Hello and welcome to Once and Future Tech. Indiana Jones is one of the most recognizable film franchises. Its cultural relevance continues to wane, and its fan base continues to age, case in point. But in many parts of the world, the Indiana Jones brand is familiar if diminished. With the release of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, it's become clear that its relevance and staying power is not what it used to be. Perhaps with the release of the imminent MachineGames Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, this will breathe new life into the character. Perhaps not. We'll see. In today's video, though, we're going to go back to a time when the franchise was at its cultural peak, the period of time immediately following the release of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in 1989. The apparent end to the film series left a void in the market for Indiana Jones media. This would be filled in a variety of ways during the early 1990s, including with the television series The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which followed the exploits of a young Henry Jones Jr. through his childhood and early adulthood. There were also video game releases on major consoles, including Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom on the Nintendo Entertainment System in 1988, multiple versions of The Last Crusade for NES, Game Boy, Sega Mega Drive, and PC, amongst others. There was also Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade: The Graphic Adventure, developed by Lucasfilm Games, which was a point-and-click adventure game in the style of Maniac Mansion and The Secret of Monkey Island. It's the successor to the graphic adventure that is the focus of this video and is one of my all-time favorite games, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. This is the boxed version of the Macintosh release of the game that my dad bought for me in the early 1990s. I remember being enamored with William Eakin's box art, which evoked the same sense of adventure as Drew Strutzon's film posters. The Macintosh system requirements require a Mac II, LC, or Quadra. I played on the Mac LC when I was a kid. This is just a sticker placed over the IBM requirements that were printed directly on the box. The game comes on 5 floppy disks, and as you can see, the adhesive is aged quite a lot. The box contains the game manual, a reference card, and a mail-in prize drawing card. Along the top and bottom of the manual's pages, there are images of disks containing suns, moons, and volcanoes. Similar disks can be found in the game, and these images act as a sort of rudimentary copy protection. Upon starting the game for the first time, you are prompted to enter the disk information found on particular pages of the manual in order to proceed. Later incarnations of the game that released on popular platforms like GOG and Steam have had their copy protection removed, but it's a fun little reminder of how things operated in the early 1990s. The other booklet included in the box is the Adventurer Pack-In magazine, featuring other LucasArts releases and products. This one is from winter 1994, and I used to thumb through it dreaming of aspirational purchases, such as this Yoda mask and especially this Darth Vader mask. It even features interviews with LucasArts employees. I like this line from a product support manager, who later became a production assistant, Chris Brown, in which she recalls a customer threatening to beat her up if she didn't provide a hint for Loom. She cheekily states, "Loom is probably our easiest game." A quick search on IMDb reveals that Chris has maintained a successful career in video game production and has contributed to voice direction on games like Sea of Thieves, Subnautica, and Psychonauts 2. Wow, that was a bit of a rabbit hole, but an interesting one. The Fate of Atlantis arrived at a time when 2D graphical adventure games were still a popular genre. The late 1980s and early 1990s were replete with point-and-click adventure games from publishers like Sierra and LucasArts. Games included popular franchises like Quest for Glory, King's Quest, Day of the Tentacle, and Loom. The year after Fate of Atlantis launched in 1992, Myst arrived on the scene, and is partly responsible for popularizing CD-ROM drives in PCs and Macs. The popularity of graphical adventure games dwindled in the 1990s, as interactive action games like Tomb Raider, Doom, and other early 3D games began to capture the public imagination. 2D point-and-click games have persisted, albeit with relatively niche audiences. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, games like The Longest Journey and Siberia kept the embers burning. More recently, spiritual successors to the genre came in the form of narrative games, such as those developed by Telltale and Don't Nod. Smaller developers like Wadjet and Cloak and Dagger still release 2D adventure games, but it's fairly safe to say that the heyday of the 2D graphical adventure game has long since passed. By the time Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis launched in 1992, LucasArts, known previously and subsequently as Lucasfilm Games, had established a relatively robust catalog of adventure games. These earlier LucasArts games adopted the EGA, or Enhanced Graphics Adapter standard, that had a maximum color palette of 16 colors. Fate of Atlantis adopted a newer graphics standard for the time, Video Graphics Array, or VGA, which introduced a 256 color palette. It also borrowed from its predecessors in both its game engine and music system. The SCUM engine, short for Script Creation Utility for Maniac Mansion, was developed by Ron Gilbert and others at Lucasfilm Games in the late 1980s. Similarities across most SCUM games include the use of a series of actions or verbs that the player chooses from to then interact with objects in the game world. SCUM also enabled games to be relatively easily ported across multiple platforms, and its legacy lives on with the SCUM VM project, which allows players to import both SCUM games and a number of non-SCUM titles into the application and play them on modern systems. The iMuse music system was developed for the sequel to Monkey Island, LeChuck's Revenge, and it allowed for dynamic music that operated on a series of triggers based on gameplay progression. In short, if you completed a specific action, such as discovering an item or solving a puzzle, scene-appropriate music would kick in. On that note, the music in Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis is a notable highlight. The composers, Clint Bahakian, Peter McConnell, and Michael Land, faithfully reproduced the Indiana Jones theme in the opening credits and throughout the game. Have a listen. The composers also add their very own unique and captivating themes that enhance the game's varied environments. The music gives each of the game's locations its unique flavor and feel, and it adds dynamism to what might otherwise be relatively static scenes. Particular highlights include Caswell Hall, Monte Carlo, and my personal favorite, Crab-like Raft. The 1992 release of Fate of Atlantis was followed the next year with a talkie version, launched on CD-ROM. In this edition of the game, Doug Lee voices Indiana Jones, and would do so again for Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine.
Practical results are years away.
Of course they are. That's why they're looking for the power of Atlantis.
Be serious. I used to think you'd make a good scientist.
Growing up, I only had the floppy version of the game, and I only came to the talkie version much later. And even now, I still prefer the voiceless version because it's easier for me to imagine Harrison Ford's voice in my head. The Fate of Atlantis is an adventure game, not an action game. For those expecting heroic scenes of Indy whipping across chasms and running through environments shooting enemies, this would likely seem a disappointment. The film tie-in games for The Last Crusade were distinguished by their subtitles, which included the action game and the adventure game. The former was developed by British developers Tiertex Design Studios, while Lucasfilm Games was responsible for the latter. The Fate of Atlantis also got its own largely forgotten action game, developed by another British developer called Attention to Detail, and LucasArts would go on to adopt a more action-oriented approach to its Indiana Jones games, with the Infernal Machine, the Emperor's Tomb, and the Staff of Kings. The the last of which has its own storied development, which is perhaps a discussion for another time. The primary aims of Fate of Atlantis include exploration, dialogue, and puzzle solving. The player collects and combines items to unlock progression. Unlike the MacGuffins of the film trilogy, which all included fictional objects like the Holy Grail, the Shankara Stones, and the Ark of the Covenant, the MacGuffin in Fate of Atlantis is the entire fictional city of Atlantis. The game was directed by Hal Barwood, who had previous screenwriting experience on some of Steven Spielberg's early films. Both Barwood and Noah Falstein are credited as designers and for conceiving of the game's story, and it's clear that they and others working on the project did their homework, as references to Plato's source material abound. Plato established the Atlantean myth in his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, and while Plato asserts that the tale of the city is true, his narrators are untrustworthy, and most scholars tend to agree that the city did not exist. As Gerard Nadaff explains, the Atlantean tale is, quote, purely Plato's invention, end quote, and can be described as, quote, a myth written in the form of a history, end quote. Plato is thought to have intended a third dialogue, the Hermocrates, but if it was ever developed, it has remained elusive. The game tackles this head-on, as one of Indy's objectives is to recover Plato's lost dialogue, which turns out to be the Hermocrates. The fictional Atlantis was a narrative device, a parable, that Plato employed to mythologize the early history of Athens and to reflect contemporary Greek politics at the time of Plato's writing in 360 BCE. In the dialogues, Athens is presented as a primitive agricultural society without meaningful trade or a navy. By contrast, Atlantis is an advanced merchant society comprised of an island city surrounded by concentric circles of canals and dedications to Poseidon. As Gill writes, it is the sort of lavish and indulgent society that Socrates rejected as hedonistic and destructive. The city's greatest strengths, its powerful navy and its vast wealth, become contributors to its decline. Its expansionist ambitions place it in conflict with the Athenians, and both sides are ultimately overcome by natural forces. Earthquakes and flooding quickly overwhelm Atlantis before the city finally disappears beneath the sea. Representations of Atlantis as a futuristic city with flying vehicles and advanced technology are a more modern construction and are not found in Plato's dialogues. Fate of Atlantis situates its imagining somewhere in between, as it presents Atlantean technology as ancient yet sophisticated. In the latter half of the game, ancient machinery is powered by beads made from the fictional gold-like metal, orichalcum, which also featured in Plato's descriptions of Atlantis. Fate of Atlantis begins with Indy exploring the library at Bartlett College, stumbling into a variety of mishaps that cause him to tumble from floor to floor while the credits roll. It's in these moments of slapstick that the links between games like Maniac Mansion feel strongest. While they are not exactly tonally consistent with Indiana Jones, they don't feel entirely out of place given the sometimes absurd scenes in the early Indy films, such as the inflatable raft drop at the start of Temple of Doom. After Indy finds what he's looking for in a basement locker, an Atlantean statue, he characteristically loses the item when it is taken from him by the Nazi spy Klaus Kerner. It's easy to see the parallels here between the loss of this artifact and the golden idol to the hands of Belloc at the start of Raiders of the Lost Ark. After chatting about the discovery and loss with Marcus Brody, Jones concludes that he must speak with an old colleague and presumed love interest, Sophia Hapgood, an expert in Atlantean history, who is making a dubious living as a psychic claiming to have a connection to the Atlantean god Nur-Ab-Sal. The understandably doubtful Indy has little time for Hapgood's mysticism, but both agree that the power of orichalcum and Atlantean technology cannot fall into Nazi hands, so they set off in an attempt to find the lost city of Atlantis before the Nazis do. In the vein of the films, Jones and Hapgood travel the world chasing down artifacts and investigating the possible location of Atlantis. The familiar travel sequence of a line traversing the world map is present here, and the characters visit a range of locations including New York, Algiers, Monte Carlo, the Azores, Iceland, and, of course, Atlantis. Indy meets a range of different characters like a crotchety artifact collector, a fraudulent goods dealer, and a cantankerous archaeologist who freezes to death while obsessively attempting to extract an Atlantean relic from a block of ice. Depending on the path you choose, which I'll get to in a moment, there are many fun, adventurous moments, including a car chase on the streets of Monte Carlo, a desert camel chase, a somewhat infuriating hot air balloon journey, and a ride on an Atlantean digging machine. Indy's whip does not see a lot of action in this game aside from some basic traversal opportunities, and his revolver is virtually absent altogether. This puzzle, early in the game, in which you need to get Sophia's attention by manipulating levers, had me stumped as a kid. Maybe it says more about my own abilities, or lack thereof, that this presented such a challenge, but it legitimately halted my progress. Then one day I was at the local library with my dad, and I stumbled across a book with hints and cheats for adventure games. Dad graciously gave me the money, and more importantly the patience, to photocopy the section on Fate of Atlantis, which helped me get past this point in the game. You can see in my other handwritten notes instances in which I found additional books at the library or bookstore that provided further assistance. This Starbucks napkin is itself a bit of an archaeological find. At least here, I did make a note of a book title, which turned out to be Brady Games' Solutions and Cheats to the Hottest PC Games published in 1995. The Fate of Atlantis developers introduced a mechanism for extending the game's replayability by creating a fork in the narrative giving the player the opportunity to choose one of three paths: wits, team, and fists. In the wits and fist paths, Indy breaks off from Sophia to pursue the adventure alone for a bit, and as the names suggest, one path is ostensibly more focused on action, while the other is focused on thinking. This alters the gameplay a bit. For instance, you use a balloon as a mode of transportation in the desert on the team and fists path, while you ride a camel on the wits path. Interactions in the different areas depend on your path, which can lead to extended or slightly truncated stays in certain locations. There is more fighting in the labyrinth on Crete while playing fists, whilst on the wits path, Indy must combine a scarf, comb, and string to create a sort of compass leading to orichalcum beads. Of course, you have to remember to put any beads you already have inside of a gold box so the detector doesn't simply point straight back to you. I prefer the wits path as I feel that there is just more to do in the game, and the submarine sequence is one of my favorites. You have to collect various items while trying to avoid being seen by the guards. To escape, you do the most logical thing, which is to load yourself into a torpedo tube and launch yourself out of it. When you reach Atlantis, the paths converge into a single narrative that you follow through to the end of the game. The Atlantean section is quite a lot of fun, as you get to enjoy the fruits of your earlier efforts. Atlantis is extensive, and its design references the concentric circle formation Plato describes in his dialogues. In the outer ring, you need to repair an ancient machine by finding various components and installing them in the correct locations. You also have to power this whole contraption on with lava held in a stone cup. I'm just wondering how Indy pocketed that into his Mark II gas mask bag without burning a hole through it like he did with the Shankara stones. One sequence requires you to travel on a crab-shaped raft to collect items necessary for freeing Sophia from her prison. On the one hand, the sequence is a bit tedious as the raft moves at a glacial pace. On the other hand, as mentioned, the crab raft theme is one of my favorites in the game. Traversal toward the final area of the game requires the use of the Atlantean digging machine, which ultimately delivers you to the innermost ring of Atlantis, where you need to find the safest way across a pool of lava while stepping on hardened segments before they disappear. This is very reminiscent of the Word of God sequence in The Last Crusade, during which Indy must step on the correct stones to avoid falling to his death. But remember,
but in the Latin alphabet, Jehovah begins with an I.
The final moments of the game have you engaged in a word battle with the game's primary antagonist, Uberman. Here you witness the hubris-fueled demise of Klaus Kerner as he leaps at the chance of becoming a god, but doesn't think through the logistics. Again, there are clear parallels with The Last Crusade, as Donovan's over-eagerness for immortality leads him to blindly accepting the false grail Elsa deliberately selects for him. The strategy with Uberman is a little more subtle. You have to carefully select your dialogue options to play to his ego and insecurities, to prevent Indy from following Kerner's fate. If successful, you get to enjoy a satisfying ending in which Sophia and Indy witness the return and the destruction. of the island city of Atlantis while sailing off into the sunset on a U-boat. Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis remains a classic game of the early 1990s. It is frequently featured on best of video games lists, and it is remembered fondly by gamers of a certain age, including me. Andy Kelly, writing in PC Gamer in 2019, states, "The story and characters are engaging, the music is superb, it's brilliantly paced, and it's better than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull." Well, that's quite a low bar, and I personally think Fate of Atlantis easily rises above the quality of the fourth film. I remember once reading that the DLC for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, titled The Fate of Atlantis, was named in homage to the Indiana Jones game. However, I cannot find evidence of that claim in more recent internet searches. The story of Fate of Atlantis was adapted into a 4-part comic book adaptation by Dark Horse Comics. According to Mishan's 2004 interview with Hal Barwood, the game was due to get a sequel titled Indiana Jones and the Iron Phoenix. But its premise of a device being sought in an attempt to resurrect Hitler would have been rejected in Germany, and the game was ultimately shelved quite a way into its development. The story later appeared in another Dark Horse comic miniseries of the same name. Ultimately, it took until 1999 to get another full-length Indiana Jones game, this time in 3 dimensions with Indiana Jones and the Infernal Machine, again directed by Hal Barwood and featuring the return of Sophia Hapgood.
Sophia, what are you doing here?
For years, Fate of Atlantis acted as a sort of stand-in for the official continuation of the Indiana Jones adventure, following the end of the film trilogy. And I recall some fans' desires to see it adapted to the big screen. That never came to pass, and instead, the next installment of the film franchise is better left forgotten. However, with the 5th film, Dial of Destiny, there is some thematic resonance with Fate of Atlantis. The hunt for the Antikythera and the central role of the Greek mathematician Archimedes feels aligned with the ancient Greek themes of the Atlantean myth. That film has its detractors as well, and fans seem a bit split on the quality of its contribution to the Indiana Jones saga. Perhaps the series should have ended with that scene of U-41 sailing into the Mediterranean sunset. As Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis fades from collective memory, it's worth remembering its humorous and well-crafted contribution to video game history. And the myth upon which Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis is grounded serves as a reminder to reject the sort of hubristic, imperialistic, and selfish pursuits that can lead to the ultimate destructive fate, the Fate of Atlantis.